At the annual street party in the quiet, middle-class neighborhood, the usual chatter and laughter filled the air. Families were reunited, old friends swapped stories, and kids darted around with sparklers in their hands, lighting up the night. It was a perfect evening until Sarah Dawson, the seemingly content wife of Henry Dawson, stepped to the center of the gathering, her voice cutting through the hum of conversation. Henry, sitting with a beer in hand, didn't notice at first. He was deep in conversation with the next-door neighbor, Brian. Sarah's face was pale, her eyes hollow with something far darker than the cheerful grin everyone expected of her. She stood on the steps of their porch, a few feet away from Henry, the momentary silence slowly turning heads. Everyone was watching, sensing something was wrong. "Henry," Sarah's voice rang out, startling those around her. "You didn't think I knew, did you? You didn't think I'd find out about your little secret?" Henry's face twisted with confusion, his heart skipping a beat. He stood up instinctively, his eyes searching the crowd for some hint of what she was talking about. The people gathered began to murmur, the buzz of the party dying down to a low hum. It was clear that whatever was unfolding was not part of the usual suburban drama. "I've known for years, Henry. Years of sneaking around. Of pretending everything was fine while you," she paused, drawing the crowd in, "spent decades with Linda down the street." The tension was palpable now. The guests looked at each other, unsure whether to laugh or feel uncomfortable. Henry's face turned crimson, and his mind raced as he realized the truth had been laid bare. Linda, the neighbor's wife, had been the affair partner, someone no one had suspected. She stood a few feet away, her eyes wide with shock, though it was clear she'd known this moment was inevitable. Sarah's voice trembled with barely contained rage as she continued, "You thought no one would notice, didn't you? Thought we were all too blind to see. But I see it now, everything." Henry's eyes locked with Linda's, his body stiff with panic. Her expression was a mix of guilt and anger, but mostly fear. Sarah, though, seemed unfazed. She had been holding this information for too long, each day burning with the knowledge of her husband's betrayal. Tonight, she had chosen to strike. The crowd stood frozen, the silence heavy. No one knew how to react. Sarah stepped forward, her eyes never leaving Henry's. "The secret's out, Henry. There's nothing you can hide now. You've humiliated me, and now I'm done pretending." Henry's lips parted, but no words came out. The usual charm and composure he had relied on in moments like these were gone. He tried to reach out to Sarah, but she stepped back, shaking her head. Brian, who had been chatting with Henry moments before, looked between the two women, trying to make sense of what was happening. His gaze shifted to Linda, who was beginning to retreat, her face flushed with shame. The whole street was watching now, the earlier jovial atmosphere replaced by uncomfortable glances and hushed whispers. Sarah didn't stop there. She turned to the neighbors who had gathered around, delivering her final words to all who would listen. "For years, I've been raising your kids, Henry. I've been the wife you pretended you loved while you sneaked behind my back with someone who was always right here, under our noses. The truth is out, and now you'll face the consequences." The party, which had once been filled with laughter, had now fallen into chaos. Conversation split into fragments, people whispered in hushed tones, unsure of how to navigate the revelation that had shattered the surface of their suburban lives. Henry stood there, his once calm demeanor broken, unable to control the storm that had been unleashed by Sarah. The truth had been outed in the most public of ways, and there was no turning back. The consequences of his actions would echo in the streets for years to come. The days that followed the street party felt like an endless spiral of whispers and judgment. The neighborhood, once tight-knit and harmonious, was now fractured. No one quite knew how to act around Henry or Sarah, and even the most casual interactions carried a weight that hadn't been there before. The silence between neighbors was deafening, filled with an unspoken awareness of the scandal that had rocked their community. Henry tried to maintain some sense of normalcy, going to work, running errands, but it was clear that the world he once knew was crumbling around him. His colleagues, who had always respected him as a reliable family man, now eyed him with a mix of pity and contempt. The once quiet street now had a different energy, one of awkwardness, of people avoiding eye contact and pretending the usual banter didn't sting. But it wasn't just the neighbors who noticed. Sarah had changed. The woman who had once been the epitome of calm and grace now wore her anger like a badge. Her presence was commanding, her voice sharper, and her eyes colder. She no longer lingered in the background, dutifully supporting her husband. Instead, she had become a woman reborn, reshaped by the revelation that had torn apart her entire existence. When Sarah spoke, people listened, but not in the way they once had. It was a quiet kind of power, the kind that came from a woman who had seen the raw truth and refused to back down. She didn't need to shout to be heard, her calm, steady gaze was enough to make anyone uncomfortable. Linda, the other half of the affair, had all but disappeared. Rumor had it that she had packed up and moved away, leaving her husband, her home, and the life she had built in this sleepy neighborhood. The scandal was too much for her to handle, or perhaps she had simply run from the mess she had helped create. No one had seen her for days, and no one seemed eager to find out where she had gone. Meanwhile, Henry's attempts to salvage what remained of his marriage were futile. He tried reaching out to Sarah, apologizing for the affair, begging for forgiveness. But Sarah wasn't listening anymore. She had already made up her mind. The truth, once buried under years of deception, had come to light, and nothing Henry could say would erase the betrayal. In the midst of it all, Sarah began to rebuild her life in ways she never thought possible. She started volunteering at the local shelter, something she had always wanted to do but had put off for years. She reconnected with old friends, people she had lost touch with while wrapped up in the quiet, comfortable life she had shared with Henry. She didn't need him to define her anymore, she was discovering who she truly was without the weight of his lies hanging over her. As for Henry, the unraveling continued. He'd been caught in a web of his own making, and now he had to face the consequences. He had no one to blame but himself. His reputation, his marriage, and his place in the community were all shattered. There was no escaping the truth, no glossing over what he had done. The street party, once a symbol of neighborhood unity, had been the catalyst for the unraveling of everything. And now, the aftermath was a painful reminder that some secrets, no matter how well hidden, always find a way to surface. Weeks passed, and the neighborhood began to find a new rhythm, though the air still felt heavy with unspoken words. People adjusted to the new dynamic, but there was an undeniable undercurrent of change. Henry had stopped attending community gatherings, and the usual wave of greetings from his neighbors had ceased. He had become a shadow in his own life, the once confident and respected man now reduced to a figure of whispered pity and resentment. Sarah, however, seemed to thrive in the aftermath. Her newfound independence was evident to everyone who crossed her path. She walked with her head held high, her shoulders squared with a strength that hadn't been there before. She had spent years playing the dutiful wife, but now she was something else entirely, someone untethered, unafraid to stand alone. She continued her work at the shelter and even started organizing community events, though they were small at first. She was slowly rebuilding her reputation, not as Henry Dawson's wife, but as Sarah Dawson, a woman in control of her own destiny. One evening, as the neighborhood gathered for a local fundraiser at the park, Sarah stood near the food stand, chatting with old friends. Her smile was genuine, but her eyes carried a hint of something deeper. There was no longer a need to hide, no longer a sense of obligation to keep up appearances. She was, for the first time in years, completely free. From across the park, Henry watched her. His eyes followed her every movement, the weight of regret pressing down on him like a physical force. He was still trying to rebuild his life, but it was clear he was struggling to find a foothold. His attempts to apologize to Sarah had been rejected each time, and the coldness in her demeanor stung him harder than he'd ever anticipated. Linda's absence weighed heavily on him as well. He had tried calling her, sending texts, but received nothing in return. It was as though she had vanished, a ghost in the wake of their affair. Henry wondered if she had truly left the area, or if she had simply disappeared into another life, leaving him behind to face the consequences alone. That night, as the street lights flickered on and the last of the event's attendees began to leave, Henry approached Sarah. His heart pounded in his chest, and for a moment, he considered turning back. But his feet betrayed him, carrying him forward against his better judgment. He cleared his throat as he stopped beside her. "Sarah," he said, his voice raw, "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I've been thinking. I can't just let things end like this. I need to make things right, somehow. I can't live with this guilt." Sarah turned slowly to face him, her expression unreadable. There was a long pause, one that felt endless to Henry as he waited for a response. She studied him, her eyes searching for something, though what exactly, he couldn't tell. "You want to make things right?" she finally asked, her tone calm but sharp. "How exactly do you think you can do that? After everything?" Henry swallowed hard. "I don't know," he admitted. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I want to prove that I can be someone worth trusting again." Sarah tilted her head slightly, studying him for a moment longer before speaking again. "You were never someone I needed to trust, Henry. That's the problem. You were never the man you pretended to be." His breath hitched, her words striking a deep, raw chord within him. He felt the weight of his own deception, of all the lies he'd told, both to Sarah and to himself. "I know," he whispered. "I wasn't." Sarah nodded, a quiet acceptance in her gaze. "No, you weren't," she said softly. "And that's why it's over." There was no malice in her voice, no bitterness, just an undeniable finality. Henry felt it, as if a door had closed, and the key had been thrown away. There was no going back, no rewinding the past. He had lost everything. As she turned away, Henry stayed where he stood, rooted to the spot, unable to move. He watched her disappear into the crowd, her figure growing smaller in the distance. A sense of emptiness washed over him. The life he had built was gone, and there was no second chance, no more time to make amends. The neighborhood had changed, but so had Sarah. And in her newfound strength, she had found the closure he could never offer. Months slipped by, and the seasons changed, but the effects of the past year lingered in the neighborhood like an unwelcome shadow. The summer heat had turned to the crisp chill of fall, the golden hues of leaves contrasting sharply with the grayness that had settled over Henry's life. His once vibrant house now seemed cold and hollow, its windows staring out like empty eyes. He no longer spent his weekends on the porch, chatting with friends or tending to his garden. The house had become a prison, a reminder of everything he had lost. Sarah, on the other hand, continued to flourish. The community now looked at her with newfound respect. She had become the backbone of several local projects, spearheading fundraisers and events that brought the neighborhood together in ways that hadn't been seen in years. People admired her resilience, her ability to move forward with grace and strength, as though she had never been shaken by the chaos Henry had brought into their lives. Henry had attempted to reach out to her, sent messages, called, but every attempt was met with silence. He had made his bed, and now he had to lie in it. The weight of his choices had become unbearable. He had sought therapy, tried to rebuild his life piece by piece, but the constant presence of his mistakes hung over him like a suffocating fog. There were no answers, no quick fixes, just the slow, inevitable passage of time. It was on one particularly cold evening, when the streets were empty and the quiet of the neighborhood felt heavier than usual, that Henry saw her again. Sarah was walking down the sidewalk, her coat wrapped tightly around her, her pace steady. She had always been someone who carried herself with purpose, but now, it was more evident than ever. Her posture was straight, her head held high, her gaze forward, as though she had no room in her life for the past, or for him. As Henry stood on his front porch, staring at her from a distance, something inside him broke. He had seen her from afar many times, but this time, the distance between them felt insurmountable. It wasn't just the physical space, it was the emotional chasm that had formed in the wake of his betrayal. She was no longer the woman he had known. She was someone entirely different, someone who had transcended the mess he had created. And it stung. It wasn't just Sarah's strength that cut him, it was the way the world had shifted around her. People had started to look at him differently, too. He wasn't the reliable neighbor, the charming man they had once trusted. He was the man who had betrayed his wife, who had broken the trust of those who had known him. The weight of his actions had turned him into a pariah, and no amount of time or effort seemed capable of erasing the damage. That evening, as Sarah disappeared into the distance, Henry felt something else, an odd sense of gratitude. He wasn't sure where it had come from, but it was there, buried deep beneath the guilt and regret. He was thankful that she had found the strength to move on, to find herself again after everything he had taken from her. He was thankful that, in the end, she had chosen to rise above it all. As the days wore on, Henry began to face the reality that there would be no reconciliation, no return to the life he had once known. Sarah had moved on, and he had to accept that. He would never get back what he had lost. But in some twisted way, the realization brought him a measure of peace. The life he had built had been built on lies, and now he would have to rebuild again, but this time, he would do it alone. And so, Henry began the slow process of trying to make amends, not to Sarah, but to himself. He focused on his work, on rebuilding his reputation in whatever way he could. He took up hobbies he had long neglected, began reading again, and started volunteering at the local community center. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He knew that he could never undo the harm he had caused, but maybe, just maybe, he could find some semblance of redemption in the days to come. As winter settled in, with the first few flakes of snow falling gently to the ground, Henry found himself standing at his front door one evening, looking at the house that had once been full of laughter and warmth. The silence in the air felt different now, no longer filled with the weight of unspoken truths. It was simply still, a quiet that allowed him to breathe again, though it was a breath tinged with sorrow. He would never forget what had happened, nor would the neighborhood. But perhaps, in time, the sting of betrayal would fade, and the community would rebuild as well, though it would never be quite the same again. It had been nearly a year since the street party, and the winter had come and gone in a blur of cold nights and fleeting moments of warmth. The neighborhood, though still marked by the scars of past events, had settled into a new normal. Henry had continued his efforts to rebuild his life, but there were days when the weight of his past seemed unbearable. He no longer had the drive he once did, the spark that had propelled him through life. His work was steady, but it lacked the passion it once had. His home, too, remained a place of solitude, the rooms empty except for the occasional echo of his footsteps. Meanwhile, Sarah had blossomed further. She was a force now, one that could no longer be ignored. Her leadership in the community had grown even stronger, and her role in local charities and events had gained her the admiration of not just the neighborhood, but people from nearby towns. She had become a pillar of strength and grace, a woman who had faced unimaginable pain and had come out on the other side, not just intact, but better for it. It was a Saturday morning when the phone rang. Henry had been sitting at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee, staring out the window at the quiet street. He had just begun to focus on his work when the sound of the phone jolted him from his thoughts. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello." His voice was rough, the result of months of restless nights and the weight of guilt that had yet to lift. "Henry, it's Sarah." His stomach tightened at the sound of her voice. It had been months since they had last spoken, and hearing it again, calm, controlled, yet still somehow distant, felt like a jolt of reality. He braced himself. "What's this about, Sarah?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm calling because I think it's time we talk," she said. Face to face. Henry felt a knot form in his throat. Was this the moment? The one he dreaded and hoped for. He had told himself over and over that he needed to accept the past and move on. That Sarah had moved on. Yet, here she was, calling him. "Okay," he said, his voice soft, betraying the nervousness he couldn't hide. "When?" "Tomorrow," she replied. "I'll come by in the afternoon." A silence hung between them, thick and unspoken, before Sarah broke it. "Henry, this isn't about what happened. It's about something else. Something I think we both need to address. We need closure." Henry had no words. The call ended with a simple goodbye, and he sat there, staring at the phone in his hand, his mind racing. Closure. What did that even mean? He had already assumed he had lost everything, his marriage, his place in the world, his sense of self. But was there something left to be said, some final piece of their story that still needed to be resolved? The next day, Henry waited. The minutes dragged on, stretching into hours, until finally, around 3 in the afternoon, he saw Sarah's car pull into his driveway. She was alone, just as she had been for months now. She stepped out, her coat wrapped tightly against the cold, her face calm but unreadable. Henry stood from his chair and walked to the door, opening it before she could knock. His heart was pounding in his chest. "Sarah," he said, his voice trembling. She offered a brief, almost imperceptible smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Hello, Henry." She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, her movements purposeful. The silence between them stretched on as she removed her coat, hung it by the door, and took a seat in the living room. Henry hesitated before joining her, unsure of how to approach this meeting, unsure of what exactly they were doing here. Sarah looked at him, her gaze steady but distant. "I've been thinking a lot about everything, about us, about what happened. And I realized something." She paused, taking a deep breath. "You're not the person I thought you were, Henry. I know that now. And I've spent so much time trying to figure out what that means. But the truth is, I've already moved on." Her words hit him like a wave. He nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of them. Of course, he knew it was true. She had moved on. She had done it long before this conversation, long before he had fully come to terms with it. But what she said next surprised him. Moving on doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean pretending it didn't happen. Her voice softened. It just means, letting go. And that's what I'm doing now. Letting go of the anger, of the hurt. Of the past. Henry's throat tightened. He had braced himself for this moment, yet hearing her speak with such finality, was still a punch to the gut. But there was something in her voice now, something less bitter, something lighter. Something that gave him hope that perhaps, just perhaps, there was a chance for him to heal. "Sarah, I'm sorry," he whispered, the words barely audible. I don't expect you to forgive me. I know I've destroyed everything we had. But I've spent every day trying to figure out how I can make it right, even if I never can." She looked at him, her expression softening. "You can't make it right, Henry. You can't change what happened. And you shouldn't try. You need to find your own way forward. Just like I had to." They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. But in that silence, Henry realized something profound. This conversation wasn't about fixing the past. It was about accepting it, moving through it, and learning to let go. Finally, Sarah stood up, her eyes meeting his one last time. "Goodbye, Henry," she said, her voice steady. "Goodbye, Sarah," he whispered in return. As she walked out the door, Henry felt the finality of it all. But in a strange, almost painful way, it felt like the beginning of something new. Not a new life, perhaps, but a new understanding of the man he had been and the man he needed to become. And as he watched Sarah drive away, Henry realized that maybe, just maybe, he could find some semblance of peace in the journey ahead. The weeks after Sarah's visit were oddly quiet, and Henry found himself wrapped in a cocoon of reflection and solitude. The numbness he had carried for months slowly started to give way to a deep sense of resignation. It wasn't the closure he had imagined, no grand moments of reconciliation or redemption, but it was enough. The finality of their conversation had allowed him to see the truth for what it was. He couldn't undo the past, and maybe it was time to stop trying to. In the days following Sarah's departure, Henry began to notice the small shifts within himself. There was a new emptiness in his heart, but it wasn't the suffocating kind that had haunted him for so long. It was quieter, more like a space where he could begin again. The guilt still lingered, but it had been joined by something else, a faint sense of responsibility. He wasn't going to wallow in self-pity forever, he was done with that. He had to move forward, even if the road was a lonely one. He started small. The morning routine that had felt like a hollow ritual now seemed like a chance for reinvention. He began running every morning, the cold air filling his lungs with each breath, clearing the fog in his mind. He took up painting, something he had always loved but never found time for, and started creating abstract pieces that somehow reflected the chaos and confusion of his past. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Work, too, began to feel less like a burden. He had been distant from his colleagues for so long, but now he found himself reaching out again, attending meetings, contributing ideas. He was still the same man he had been, but with one significant difference: he no longer cared about maintaining the image of the perfect family man. His role was just one part of who he was, no longer his entire identity. The neighbors, though, had not forgotten. Sarah's strength had inspired them, and while some began to treat Henry with a kind of cautious sympathy, others still held him at arm's length. They spoke about him behind his back, no doubt still haunted by the whispers of his betrayal. The once warm, welcoming feeling of the street had been replaced by a chill that Henry felt every time he ventured outside. But he didn't mind anymore. He had come to terms with the fact that there were no shortcuts to healing. His actions had consequences, and it would take time for the neighborhood to find its balance again. A few months later, a letter arrived for him. It was from Sarah. The letter was short, simple, and to the point. She had written that she had moved to a new city, somewhere far enough away from the old neighborhood to give herself the space she needed. The letter wasn't an invitation to visit or even to reconnect. It was, in Sarah's words, a final gesture, a way for her to leave the past behind completely, with no strings attached. But what struck Henry most was one line near the end: "I hope you find what you're looking for, Henry. And I hope you find peace." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. But it was something that he hadn't dared to hope for, an acknowledgement that they both had moved on, and that Sarah had, at least in some way, let go of the anger. It was enough. Henry tucked the letter into his drawer, the weight of it both comforting and heartbreaking. He wasn't ready to forget what had happened, not yet. But the letter gave him a small sense of peace. Perhaps, in some way, Sarah had truly found hers, and maybe he could find his too. As the months passed, the numbness Henry had felt began to fade. He didn't stop thinking about what he'd done, how he had hurt the woman who had once loved him, how he had betrayed not just her, but himself. But it became easier to bear. He no longer expected to undo the past, but instead, he worked toward a future where the mistakes he had made didn't define him. He still ran every morning, and his painting continued to be an outlet for the emotions he couldn't articulate. Some days, he felt close to a breakthrough, as though he was standing on the edge of something he couldn't quite grasp. It was a new life, one that didn't have the comforts of the past but one that carried its own quiet dignity. And when he walked past the old house they had once shared, the one now empty and silent, he no longer felt the crushing weight of regret. Instead, he felt a sort of respect for it, the house that had once held their dreams, their laughter, their love. It had also held their betrayal, their pain, and their loss. But that was over now. The past was no longer an anchor, it was a part of him, but it no longer dictated his future. In the end, Henry realized that healing wasn't about erasing the past, it was about living with it. It was about accepting the mistakes, acknowledging the damage, and finding a way forward in spite of it. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. A year had passed since the letter from Sarah, and in that time, Henry had come to understand that peace was something you didn't find overnight. It wasn't a destination. It was something that you built, layer by layer, with patience and humility. It was knowing that you couldn't erase the past, but you could make better choices moving forward. The neighborhood, too, had begun to heal. The whispers about Henry had dulled to a quiet murmur. Most people had gone back to their routines, their lives, but the events that had unfolded over the previous years had changed the fabric of their little community. There were still awkward moments when people ran into Henry in the street, those hesitant smiles, the quiet nods, but no one shunned him like they once did. Slowly, they accepted that he was a man who had paid for his mistakes, who wasn't hiding from them, but acknowledging them. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something. Henry spent more time out of the house now, attending neighborhood meetings and walking the dog he had adopted from the local shelter, a small, scrappy terrier that had somehow found him at the same time he was beginning to rebuild. The dog had brought with it a sense of comfort, a daily routine that grounded him. They would walk around the neighborhood in the mornings, with Henry smiling faintly at the familiar sights, Mrs. Jensen waving from her garden, the Johnsons out walking their children to the bus, and even Brian, the neighbor who had once been Henry's close friend, giving him a nod as they crossed paths. The awkwardness had faded, but it was still there, lingering just below the surface. Henry had begun to reconnect with some of the people he had lost touch with, not in an effort to fix things, but simply to rebuild what he had lost in his own heart, the ability to trust and be trusted. He was no longer the man he had been, the man who had lived in a bubble of lies, trying to keep up appearances. He was just Henry now. A man who had made terrible mistakes, but who was working to make his life meaningful again. One evening, Henry sat down at his dining table, surrounded by paintings that still reflected his struggle, chaotic strokes of color and wild patterns, pieces that represented both the turmoil and the small moments of peace he had found along the way. He was working on his latest canvas, but his thoughts were interrupted when the doorbell rang. It was an unexpected visitor. He opened the door to find Brian standing there, his hands in his pockets, an awkward but genuine expression on his face. The last time they had spoken, there had been an unspoken rift between them, a distance born from the betrayal Henry had committed, and Brian's sense of loyalty to his own wife, Linda. The last thing Henry had expected was for Brian to seek him out. "Hey," Brian said, looking uncertain but steady. "I've been thinking. I never really apologized for how I treated you after everything went down. It wasn't just the affair, but the way I distanced myself. I was angry, and I didn't know how to deal with it. But I've seen how you've been trying to get better, and I just wanted to say, I respect that." Henry stood still for a moment, surprised by the sudden acknowledgement. It wasn't an apology he had expected, but it was more than he had hoped for. There was an honesty in Brian's words, something that reached across the divide that had existed between them. "It's been a rough road for all of us," Henry replied, his voice steady but layered with emotion. "I'm sorry, too, Brian. For everything. I know I hurt a lot of people, including you. I don't expect things to go back to how they were, but I'm trying to make things right. One step at a time." Brian nodded, his shoulders relaxing a little. "I know. And that's all anyone can do, right? Make things right. I don't expect us to be best friends again, but maybe we can start fresh. You're still part of this neighborhood, and I think, maybe we can just leave the past in the past." There was a moment of quiet understanding between them, an unspoken agreement that while the past couldn't be changed, there was room to move forward. "Yeah," Henry said, his voice a little lighter. "I'd like that." As Brian turned to leave, he gave Henry one last nod. "Take care, Henry." "Take care, Brian," Henry replied, watching him walk back down the street. After the door closed, Henry stood for a long moment, reflecting on what had just happened. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was a start. It was proof that even after everything, some bridges could still be rebuilt, even if they were never exactly the same. Henry returned to his painting, but this time, there was a shift. The strokes of color on the canvas felt more purposeful. Less chaotic. More deliberate. It wasn't that the pain had disappeared, but now, it was woven into something more constructive, something that represented healing rather than brokenness. The following days felt different. Lighter, somehow. He found himself having more conversations with people around the neighborhood, small talk, yes, but also moments of genuine connection. The man who had been lost in shame and regret had started to find himself again, not by erasing the past, but by embracing it with all its imperfections. And so, as winter gave way to the first hints of spring, Henry stood in the yard one evening, looking up at the sky as the last of the day's light faded. The neighborhood, the people, and even his own heart felt different. The echoes of the past were still there, but they no longer defined him. He had learned, the hard way, that peace wasn't a destination, it was a process. It was in the quiet moments, the small gestures, and the steps forward that mattered most. For the first time in a long while, Henry allowed himself to believe that he was, at last, moving in the right direction. Spring had fully settled over the neighborhood by the time Henry found himself standing at the front door again, this time with a different kind of anticipation. The seasons had turned, just as his life had. He'd spent months rebuilding, not just the house and its surroundings, but the most important parts of himself. He had put in the work, faced his demons, and, slowly but surely, had started to feel like a man who could live with the consequences of his choices. Sarah hadn't been in touch since that last letter, and Henry had long accepted that part of his life was over. But even so, there remained a quiet ache in his chest, a space where the memories of their time together lived. Not in anger, not in regret, but in a kind of acceptance. She had gone on with her life, and he had his own to live, one step at a time. It was a Saturday morning when the doorbell rang again. This time, it wasn't a call or a visitor he expected. Henry opened the door cautiously, unsure of who would be standing there this time. To his surprise, it was Linda. The woman who had been the catalyst for so much of his pain, the one with whom he'd shared the affair that had destroyed so many lives, stood in front of him, looking just as she had all those years ago, only there was something different now. The stiff, guarded expression that once defined her was gone, replaced by something tentative, uncertain. "Linda?" Henry said, his voice filled with disbelief. She looked at him, her eyes soft with years of untold stories. "I know I'm the last person you probably want to see, Henry, but I need to apologize." For a moment, Henry couldn't speak. He had spent so much time trying to move on from the pain she had caused, trying to untangle the mess they'd made, but hearing those words from her, spoken so quietly and sincerely, was something he hadn't expected. He had spent years turning the past over in his mind, but seeing her here now felt like an unexpected piece of the puzzle snapping into place. "I'm sorry," she repeated, her voice breaking slightly. "I was selfish, and I caused so much hurt, to you, to Sarah, to everyone around us. I thought I could escape from it, from all the consequences. But I never did, and now I realize. I owe you this." Henry stood still for a moment, unsure of how to respond. There was a time, years ago, when he would have welcomed this moment, when he would have been desperate for an apology, craving validation for the hurt he had endured. But now, something inside him had shifted. The anger was gone, replaced by a weariness that only time could bring. "I don't know what to say," Henry finally answered, his voice steady but calm. I guess I've already moved on. Not from the pain, but from the anger. We can't undo what happened. I think we're both just trying to live with it now." Linda nodded, her expression softening. "That's exactly it. And I think that's why I came here, to finally face it, to acknowledge what I did, and to apologize to you. I don't expect anything from you, Henry. I just needed you to know that I'm sorry. The silence between them felt heavy, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was as if both of them were standing in the same space, acknowledging the past but not letting it define them anymore. I understand, Henry said, his voice low but sincere. I appreciate it. I really do. Linda gave him a small, almost sad smile before turning to leave. Take care, Henry. And as she walked down the path, Henry stood there for a while, watching her disappear into the distance. He didn't feel relief or closure, there was no grand epiphany. But there was something lighter, something that allowed him to take a deep breath. It was a kind of acceptance, a small, quiet peace that was finally settling into his bones. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Henry found himself cleaning up the yard, the sun casting long shadows across the grass. He couldn't explain why, but for the first time in years, he felt something like hope stirring inside him. It wasn't the kind of hope that came with promises of a perfect future, but the kind that was grounded in the present, the kind that said, you are enough, just as you are. You are doing the best you can, as evening fell, Henry found himself sitting on the porch, the cool breeze gently ruffling the leaves. The dog curled up beside him, and he leaned back in his chair, looking up at the stars beginning to dot the sky. It was quiet, peaceful. The kind of peace that had eluded him for so long. In the distance, he could see the faint outline of Sarah's old house. She was long gone, but her presence still lingered in the neighborhood, in the memories they had shared. Henry thought about the life they had once dreamed of, and while it hurt, it no longer consumed him. He had made his mistakes, but he was still here, still moving forward. And for the first time in a long time, he believed that, despite everything, he might just be okay. The past was always going to be a part of him, but it didn't have to control him. He had learned the hardest lesson of all, that peace wasn't a place, it was something you found within yourself, no matter how broken you might feel. And that was enough. With a deep, contented breath, Henry stood up from the porch, ready to face whatever came next. He didn't have all the answers, and the road ahead would still be long, but he no longer feared it. He had finally found the strength to live, not in spite of his past, but because of it. And as the stars sparkled above, he realized that this was the beginning of something new, something he could embrace with open arms. The final chapter was not an ending, but the start of a new story. His story.